Hello, everyone. My name is Scott Maudsley, and I have had a lifelong interest in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Over the many years I have been studying this famous historical event and taking part in online discussions about it, one question keeps coming up over and over: the issue of Oswald's motive. Recently, I commented on an article discussing the 60 reasons to doubt Oswald's guilt for the 60th anniversary of the assassination. The number one thing on that list was the issue of motive. Also, years ago, I appeared on the Lone Gunman podcast with Rob Clark, and the issue of Oswald's motives was one that we discussed. Understanding the reasons and motives behind Lee Oswald's actions requires deep study and digression into other fields not necessarily directly related to the actual assassination itself. To paraphrase Lee's brother Robert, in order to understand the assassination, you have to understand my brother Lee, and Lee is not an easy person to understand. A quick disclaimer here: this video is meant to be a discussion of Lee Harvey Oswald and his psychology and motives. As such, we will be examining his biography, but many things have been omitted from that discussion. The video will also not focus on the events of November 22nd, 1963, although they will be mentioned insofar as they can help us understand Oswald's psychology, motives, and actions. I am not a professional or expert anything. I'm just a regular normal guy who has spent his life studying the assassination of President Kennedy. The opinions expressed here are my own unless otherwise stated. That being said, I will be making reference to a couple of sources, primarily two main sources: Oswald's Game by Gene Davidson, which is an excellent resource in understanding Oswald, his psychology and motives. In particular, the final chapter, also entitled Oswald's Game, is a great summary of Oswald's life and all the factors which led him to assassinating JFK. The second source is a study entitled Inside the Criminal Mind by the authors Jacobson and Samenow. This was originally a 3 volume study that was originally published in the 1970s, but has since been combined into a single volume work and updated to include more modern information. For the purposes of simplicity, I will simply refer to this as the Samenow study. Samenow notes that the terms antisocial, criminal personality, sociopath, and psychopath all essentially have the same meaning when applied to the understanding of criminal behavior. These terms should be viewed interchangeably, and throughout the course of this discussion, I will use them interchangeably. Another way of seeing these people would be to simply call them what they are: miserable losers. And as the old expression goes, misery loves company. When someone is a miserable loser, they want to inflict that misery on everyone else. They want everyone to be miserable and unhappy, just like they are. Simply put, these personality types never see themselves as the aggressor or the victimizer in any situation. They will always have an excuse for their behavior, and they will always paint themselves as the victim. A victim of bad parents, of circumstance, and of society itself. These people will diminish any harm that they cause, and indeed, as Samenow notes, they often conceptualize the very notion of harm in a way that normal people can never understand. According to Samenow, unless one of their victims is left beaten half to death and bloody in the street, there has been no harm, at least not in the mind of the antisocial criminal sociopath. Samenow recounts the story of two young offenders who perpetrated an armed robbery of a restaurant that one of them had previously worked at. So he knew that late at night it would be only two older women working there alone. The two offenders went in with ski masks on and with a gun in their hands, tied the women up, and robbed the restaurant. They were easily captured because one of the women recognized the former employee despite him wearing a ski mask, and she also recognized his voice as he was shouting commands at her. When Samenow later interviewed the offenders in their jail cell, one of them said, "We didn't hurt anyone. There was no blood and no broken bones. The harm that these criminals had done to two innocent women was totally invisible to the antisocial criminal personality type." Samenow refers to this as an error in thinking, and his work discusses many of these errors in thinking and how they shape the actions and thoughts of the antisocial criminal. Errors in thinking like this permeate the story of Lee Harvey Oswald. These people see themselves as above most people and apart from the world. They find the normal, everyday, ordinary life to be boring and unexcited. They are pathologically discontent and unhappy. Their criminal behavior is born from a need for excitement and adventure. Everything and everyone else becomes secondary to that. Indeed, someone I know from the JFK assassination groups even wrote a book entitled Malcontent about Lee Oswald. A fitting title. He totally was a malcontent, as all antisocial criminal types are. There is significant overlap here. Davidson in her work makes repeated reference to the Samanow study, and with good reason. As you will see in the coming discussion, Lee Oswald in many ways possessed an archetypal and stereotypical antisocial criminal personality. Both of these works, Oswald's Game and Inside the Criminal Mind, are available on Audible if anyone is interested in further study. While these are the two primary sources I will be drawing on, there are a few more that are worth mentioning. Marina and Lee by Priscilla Macmillan is the definitive biography of Marina Oswald and the definitive account of her relationship with Lee. This source is essential for understanding the nature of the relationship between Marina and Lee and provides great insight into the marriage and Lee's behavior. Interestingly, as a young reporter, Macmillan actually met and interviewed Lee in Russia when he was a defector. Another source worth mentioning is the excellent talk given by Dr. Jean Riddle at the Sixth Floor Museum, entitled Towards a Psychological Understanding of Lee Harvey Oswald. In particular, I would draw attention to a comment that Dr. Riddle makes at the beginning of his presentation, wherein he asks the audience to think of someone they know personally who is kind of like Lee Oswald. Someone who is an outsider and enjoys being one, maybe someone who did not have the best parents or upbringing and has had a hard time taking responsibility for things, someone who is a dislikable person and who has problems getting along with others and maintaining employment because of that. I would just like to add to that by saying, think about somebody you knew in your life who was a loser, because we have all unfortunately known at least one of those in our lives. For the purposes of this discussion, I will make reference to a former friend of mine that I knew a lifetime ago, whom I will simply refer to as T. Also worth noting is Chapter 7 of the Warren Report, entitled Lee Harvey Oswald, Background and Possible Motives. All of these sources are worth studying on the road to understanding the true motives and psychology that underlies Lee Oswald's actions, but only through the synthesis of all available information from all available sources can we hope to reach a real understanding of these things. However, as Chapter 7 of the Warren Report notes, quote, the motives of any man, however, must be analyzed in terms of the particular individual involved. For a motive that appears incomprehensible to other men may be the moving force of a man whose view of the world has been twisted, possibly by factors of which those around him were only dimly aware. Davidson opens her book with a quote from Bertrand Wolf's Three Who Made a Revolution. In it, she recounts a story told to Lenin's wife by Trotsky, wherein Trotsky was traveling down the road when he saw a man squatting on the side of the road, hands moving about quickly. Trotsky thought to himself, this guy is a crazy person, and I need to be careful as I pass him. But upon drawing closer, Trotsky saw that what the man was actually doing was sharpening the blade of a knife against the paving stones. Both of these quotes demonstrate that what at first glance may appear to be crazy nonsense actually has a purpose. It just might not be immediately obvious. One must look closer in order to see the true nature of the so-called crazy act and understand it in a better context. Samanow notes in his study that there is no one set of factors which can explain the presence of an antisocial criminal personality. These personality types can arise from members of any social economic class and can be born into any family. That is not to say that who one's parents are have nothing to do with who their children will eventually become, but it is possible to have good parents and come from a good family and still be an antisocial criminal. A good example on both ends of this would be Ted Bundy on the one end of the spectrum, who was the child of a single teenage mother, who he was raised to believe was his older sister. When he found out the truth, it profoundly affected his views about women in general and his crimes against them. Ted Bundy targeted women exclusively. On the other end of the spectrum is an example of a guy named George Ayala. Rivi, or Rivrita, as he was known at the time, is one of the most prominent of the so-called cocaine cowboys of the 1970s and 80s. Rivi has confessed involvement in over a dozen homicides and suspected involvement in 24 more. Rivi came from a regular normal middle-class family in Detroit. He went to Catholic school and had a good upbringing. His father worked at General Motors, and that is where, as a young man, he learned how to break into cars and hotwire them. Rivy himself in the documentary Cocaine Cowboys said, quote, I had a good life and a good upbringing. I didn't need to break into cars. It was just the fun and excitement of doing it. I was a bad boy from the very beginning. In this, we see a surprising level of self-awareness from someone who possesses a criminal personality. This is very rare. Most criminals are not nearly this self-aware. Here, Rivy is telling us that his life of crime was born of straight-up boredom and a need for excitement. Samino echoes this idea in his studies, citing the boredom that antisocial criminal types often experience with day-to-day life. Their crimes, in many ways, are an attempt to relieve this boredom. A quick digression here. If you've never seen the documentary Cocaine Cowboys, I highly recommend it, as I do the biography of another subject of the documentary, John Roberts, entitled American Desperado. I cannot recommend these enough. They are both very interesting and capture a unique time in American history. But I digress. No discussion of Lee Oswald's psychology would be complete without reference to his mother, Marguerite. In his talk at the Sixth Floor Museum, Dr. Riddle mentions that the phrase most commonly associated with her is a real piece of work. Dr. Riddle notes with some humor that this phrase does not appear anywhere in the clinical literature. In the modern parlance, we might refer to Marguerite as a so-called Karen. Where I come from, we have other terms to refer to women like this. However, I will refrain from using those terms in polite company. An inherently dislikable person who can never get along with anyone ever and sees themselves as the eternal victim of the world and society. Davidson in her work notes the opinion of Marguerite's sister, Lillian Murrett, who noted that in any disagreement, Marguerite had to be right, even when she was wrong. Whenever she had a conflict with her sister, she would cease all contact with her until the time came where she needed money or a place to stay. Lee's father died 2 months before he was born. Marguerite buried him the very same day, an act that her in-laws never forgave her for. As Dr. Riddle notes in his presentation, this suggests someone who is fundamentally incapable of processing their emotions in a normal and healthy way. I would add to it that it also suggests someone who does not have the ability to think about the needs of others. After the assassination, Marguerite, while receiving a free ride into the city, care of a local radio station, who she contacted to let them know that she was the accused assassin's mother, sat in the back of the car, literally crying about how everyone would care about the president's wife and kids and the murdered police officer's wife and kids and Lee's wife and kids, but no one would care about her. That was the kind of person she was. Of her 3 children, Lee was the one who spent the most time with his mother as a child, and he was the one who most came to resemble her. Lee's brother Robert will later say that his mother did a lousy job of raising him. He said that his mother had an entitled attitude, that she believed that the world owed her something and that she was meant to be someone important, despite having done nothing in her life to distinguish herself. Indeed, there's a scene in the movie Parkland where Marguerite says to Robert that she is the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald and that she will never be a normal person again. Robert says he believes these personality traits were passed on to Lee. Marguerite, it should be noted, had 3 sons in total. The oldest, John Pick, was from her first marriage. Robert and Lee were from her second, and she would go on to have a third marriage, which eventually ended in divorce. Here we see her inability to maintain long-term meaningful relationships with her intimate partners. With the exception of Lee's father, Robert, who died of a heart attack, and indeed, one has to wonder if her overbearing personality had something to do with that. It could not have been easy to be married to her, as her other husbands had sought divorce on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. This is one of the many things Lee would eventually come to share with his mother, an inability to maintain any kind of personal or intimate relationship. He claimed to have had relationships with women in Japan, and we know he briefly dated Ella German in Russia, but we never saw him have a prolonged friendship with anyone in his story other than Marina, of course. When he was in Youth House in New York, a subject which we will cover in more detail later, he was asked if he preferred the company of boys or girls, to which he responded, I dislike everybody. That was the kind of person Lee and his mother were, the kind who dislike everybody. Say it with me now: antisocial, sociopathic, criminal personality types. In other words, miserable losers. After her divorce from her third and final husband, Marguerite complained about how unfairly she was treated, and dwelling on the fact that she was now a single mom with 3 kids. Although John Pick would later say that he didn't think his mother had it much worse than other people. Indeed, Pick thought that his mother often overstated her financial problems and was unduly concerned with money. Pick said, quote, Lee was brought up in this atmosphere of constant money problems, and I am sure it had quite an effect on him. Perhaps here was the beginning of Lee adopting his mother's persecution complex and victim mentality. He would hear his mother endlessly complain about these things, and being a young child, he would not understand that his mom was a Karen who complained about literally everything and anything and was really just a miserable loser. Lee's lifelong history of violence had also begun at this point, a history that would continue all throughout his short 24-year life and would be present right up until the final days of that life. He had struck his mother on a few occasions, and later, when Lee and his mother relocated to New York to stay with his half brother John Pick and his wife, an incident occurred wherein Lee pulled a knife on his sister in law when she told him not to put a drinking glass on the bookcase in the apartment. His mother attempted to downplay the significance of this event, but his sister-in-law saw it right for what it was. It was a manifestation of his antisocial criminal personality, although I'm sure she did not use those exact words. When his brother John Pick returned home, Lee refused to discuss this event with him, and shortly thereafter, Lee and his mother left for their own apartment in the Bronx. Lee's relationship with his brother John never recovered from this incident. Here is a good place to make my first reference to my former friend T. We had known each other for many years and had always been good friends. One day, T and another guy I also used to know named E went to a third friend's house, a guy who I will simply call R. We played a game of Risk, had a few drinks, and left. R drove us back to our neighborhood. Along the way, we passed T's apartment building. T said nothing as we did this. Upon arriving back in our neighborhood, T asked R to drive him home. This surprised us because we were all expecting to spend the night hanging out together. At this point, as the car was backing out, E said something like, "Fine, go on then," and tapped the passenger side door with the heel of his foot. Not a hard kick or anything, really, just a light tap. At this, T became enraged and told R to stop the car, got out, chased E down, assaulted him, and poured beer all over him. All of this over a little tap on the door as the car was driving away. As T returned to the car, I got in between him and the car and I asked him, "Why are you doing this? Why are you acting this way?" To which T responded, and I will always remember this moment. T touched his chest and said to me in an incredulous tone, "Me?" And then he turned and waved his hand over the scene he had just created and said to me, "This is all you." Apparently, I was responsible for his actions, and for some reason, he was not. Also, my former friend T would never explain why he had gotten so violent so quickly, just as Lee would not explain to his brother why he pulled a knife on his sister-in-law. The only comment I remember my friend T making about this was that E had gotten what he deserved. This behavior very much reminds me of the incident with Lee pulling the knife on his sister-in-law, a gross overreaction to a minor incident, and just as Lee's relationship with his brother John never recovered, so too was this the beginning of the end of my relationship with my former friend T. I just didn't realize it at the time. Much later, Marina would comment on Lee's potential for explosive violence over minor issues. She noted that Lee was very unrestrained and very explosive, and that, quote, Lee became very irritable and sometimes some completely trivial thing would drive him into a rage. Here again is another good place to recall the words of Dr. Riddle. Think about someone you might have known in your own personal life who was just like this. Or if you're like me, a member of the working class, and you've ever had a job which required you to interact with the public, I am sure you have had the misfortune of dealing with someone just like this, which is to say, someone who is willing to have a complete emotional breakdown and get violent over the most minor and petty issue. On September 30th, 1952, Lee enrolled in PS 117, a junior high school. Here, he began being truant almost immediately. Truant charges were brought against him, alleging that he was beyond the control of his mother insofar as school attendance is concerned. I would add that he was beyond the control of his mother in other ways too, but I digress. Upon being caught by a truant officer at the Bronx Zoo, Lee was sent to youth house for psychiatric observation. During his time there, he was interviewed by several doctors, and these interviews provide great insight into his mind, particularly at this point in his life when he was in an important developmental stage. The term vivid fantasy life, turning around the topics of omnipotence and power, appears in these reports, and this is something that the people who knew Oswald would later comment on. His brother Robert would later comment that when his little brother Lee would watch a TV show, he would still be fantasizing about the characters hours and days later. Marina once said to Ruth Paine, in his mind, he is a big important person. He pretends that he is doing these big important things. One of the people who evaluated Lee, Evelyn Strickland, later Evelyn Siegel, perhaps provided the greatest insight into the nature of his psychology at this time. She noted that, quote, he had detached himself from the world around him because no one in it ever met any of his needs for love. He withdrew into a completely solitary and detached existence where he didn't as he wanted, and he didn't have to live by any rules or come into contact with people. He admitted to fantasies about being powerful and sometimes hurting and killing people. Samenow also comments on this study. Samenow also comments on this in his study. This is a very common feature of people who have an antisocial criminal personality type. Since they find the real world in real life to be boring and unappealing, they retreat into a fantasy life, and oftentimes these fantasies revolve around a theme of violence because that appeals to the antisocial need for power and control. The authorities recommended that Oswald be placed on probation on the condition that he seek help and guidance through a child guidance clinic, and the possibility of commitment was considered if the probation plan was not successful. Dr. Riddle, in his talk at the Sixth Floor Museum, notes that given the openness Lee had in talking to Evelyn Siegel, Dr. Riddle believes that Lee would have been a good candidate for therapy, but he also notes that Lee's mother was the kind of mother that would have interfered in his treatment if he was making progress, because she would have felt that it reflected badly on her as a mother, as someone else had to fix her kid. The authorities in New York also commented on Marguerite herself. Mrs. Siegel described her as a self-possessed and alert and superficially affable, but essentially a defensive, rigid, and self-involved person who had real difficulty in accepting and relating to people. She noted that Marguerite had little understanding of Lee's behavior and of the protective shell he had drawn around himself. Dr. Hardogs, another doctor who examined Lee at Youth House, noted, Mrs. Oswald did not understand that Lee's withdrawal was a form of violent but silent protest against his neglect by her and represents his reaction to a complete absence of any real family life. I think it should be clear at this point that Marguerite was a narcissist, and the thing about narcissists is that when they have children, they don't really see them as being independent and autonomous beings with their own lives and personalities, but rather extensions of themselves. So in this way, acknowledging that Oswald had problems would have been tantamount to admitting that she had failed to raise him properly, and would have been the equivalent of self-criticism, something narcissists are loath to do. Lee's behavior continued to be unacceptable. Even though he did briefly return to school, his behavior did not improve, and his mother failed to cooperate with school authorities in any way. The authorities were considering placing Oswald in a home for boys when his mother took him back to Louisiana, beyond the reach of the authorities in New York. Before we leave Oswald's time in New York, there is one other incident that we need to discuss. It is believed that during a Mother's Day protest, Lee was handed a pamphlet about the case of the Rosenbergs. Davidson, in her work Oswald's Game, notes that this is an extreme historical irony because it was during a similar protest a generation before where a young Julius Rosenberg was also handed a pamphlet about the case of a labor leader named Tom Mooney. It is indeed a great historical irony because the road to radicalization for both Julius Rosenberg and Lee Oswald began the exact same way in the exact same city, by, innocently enough, being handed a pamphlet by someone on the street. I would add to Davidson's observation that for all we know, it was upon the exact same street corner that both of these guys began their radicalization process in the exact same way, making the historical irony all the greater. This is a key moment in understanding Lee Oswald's psychology, not necessarily because of the actual beliefs of the Rosenbergs themselves, but rather because it instilled in him an idealistic concept in his mind. That of two people who were so dedicated to something that they were literally willing to die for it, to leave behind their small children because this cause they attached themselves to was of a much greater importance. These people put their ideology above literally everything else, above their country, above their children, and even above their very own lives. This would end up becoming the primary axis around which Lee would live his entire life, searching for the purpose for which he could sacrifice himself to. I think Lee found concepts of martyrdom to be attractive. It should also be noted that the Rosenbergs were leftist heroes who were venerated and praised by those on the left for years to come. This would also have appealed to Oswald, who would have seen them as persecuted victims of the capitalist system, much as he saw himself in his own mother. When Oswald returned to Louisiana, his interest in communism only increased. Many people who knew him from this point in his life commented on the times Oswald praised communism or made comments in support of the communist system, even going so far as to comment that President Eisenhower should have been killed because he was exploiting the working class. It was shortly after this that Oswald finally dropped out of school. His mother thought he could decide for himself if he wanted to stay in school or not, despite only having a ninth grade education, again demonstrating her inability to control or raise her son properly. Despite his leftist politics, Lee joined the Marine Corps. The Warren Report notes that Lee's decision to join the Corps was greatly influenced by his older brother Robert, who had joined a few years before. His other brother, John Pick, would later say that Lee's motivation to join the Corps was to get out from under the yoke of oppression of their mother, same as he himself had done by joining the Coast Guard and Robert had done by joining the Marine Corps. Lee's inability to form meaningful relationships with anyone would follow him into the Marine Corps. Oswald honestly believed that the institution of the Marine Corps would roll out the red carpet and treat him as the special person that he thought he was. When he found out that he was going to get treated exactly the same as everybody else, he immediately began to chafe against it. A Marine Corps colleague of Oswald's, Carrie Thornley, provides insight into Oswald's time in the Marine Corps. From his accounts, we can see the nature of Oswald's inherent antisocial personality, baiting superiors into arguments about foreign affairs, a subject that he was intimately familiar with, and using their inability to keep up with these arguments as proof of his inherent superiority. Thornley goes on to say that, quote, Oswald's extreme personal sloppiness in the Marine Corps fitted into a general personality pattern of his, to do whatever was not wanted of him. He further noted that Oswald seemed to go out of his way to get into trouble and then used the special treatment he received as an example of the way in which he was being picked on and as a means of getting or attempting to get sympathy. Apparently, Lee thought the Marine Corps was his mommy and would pander to and accommodate him the same way that she did. Thornley's brief friendship with Oswald ended in a similar manner as my own friendship with T ended, over a minor petty issue. On the parade grounds one day, Oswald made a comment about the stupidity of the Marine Corps, and Thornley said, well, come the revolution, you will change all that. To which Oswald cried out, not you too, Thornley, and the two never spoke again. During his time in the Marine Corps, Oswald was court-martialed twice, once for possessing an unauthorized weapon, which he accidentally shot himself with, although some have suggested that it was not an accident at all, that Oswald deliberately shot himself in order to avoid being shipped out with the rest of his unit. Oswald was alone when the shooting occurred, and several Marines came running into the room after the shooting, but the truth is we do not know if this was really an accident or not, and we'll never really know for sure. Here is yet another place where Oswald demonstrated his similarity to archetypal and stereotypical antisocial criminals. His secrecy, even in circumstances where it was totally unnecessary. Marina would later comment on this trait to her biographer, Priscilla Macmillan. Being a naturally born Soviet citizen, Marina could inherently understand the desire for secrecy and the distrust one could have for the authorities and the government. However, Lee's secrecy went far beyond that. As Samenow notes, secrecy is primarily in the criminal mind because it feeds their need for power and control. By having secrets, the criminal mind is able to elevate itself above others in an I know something you don't know type of way. The incident with the unauthorized firearm shows Oswald's need to have secrets even when doing so makes no logical purpose. Why did he have an unauthorized firearm while in the Marine Corps? What purpose did it serve? The only thing he ended up accomplishing it with it was to shoot himself. It's not like he needed it for anything. It's not like the Marine Corps doesn't have firearms. The other time was for pouring a drink on a superior officer and challenging to a fight during an altercation in a bar. Oswald will later claim that the drink was accidentally spilled, but the officer involved will later testify that Oswald knew exactly what he was doing. Oswald, as a Marxist Marine, stood out. When he played chess with another Marine, he would always select the red pieces and say that he preferred the Red Army. When a fellow Marine played music by Russian composers, he would show up and say, "You called?" Eventually, the other Marines took to calling him Oswaldovich and Comrade, which he seemed to enjoy. Enjoying being different and an outsider, transgressing social norms, and ruffling people's feathers are all hallmarks of an antisocial criminal personality type. Normal people do not behave this way, and winners do not behave this way. Losers do. Chapter 7 of the Warren Report, entitled Lee Harvey Oswald Background and Possible Motives, notes, quote, Oswald's interest in Marxism led some people to avoid him, even though, as his wife suggested, that interest may have been motivated by a desire to gain attention. He used his Marxist and associated activities as excuses for his difficulties in getting along in the world, which were usually caused by entirely different factors. His use of those excuses to present himself to the world as a person who was being unfairly treated is shown most clearly by his employment relations after his return from the Soviet Union. Of course, he made his real problems worse to the extent that his use of those excuses prevented him from discovering the real reasons for and attempting to overcome his difficulties. End quote. A neurotic professional victim, blaming the world for his inability to get along with others and function normally as an adult. 3 months prior to his regularly scheduled separation date, Lee received an early discharge to care for his mother, who had been injured in an accident at work. A jar of candy fell on her face and when she wrote to Lee to tell him about it, he saw his chance to use this event as a way to get out of the Marine Corps. He wrote to his mother instructing her on what to say in her letters to facilitate him leaving the Marine Corps to take care of her. It worked, and when he returned to America, he stayed with his mom for less than a week before boarding a freighter and departing for Europe. One subject that needs to be addressed is the letter that Lee sent to his brother Robert after arriving in the Soviet Union, because this letter is very illustrative of his antisocial nature. In the letter, he tells his brother that he would kill any American, his emphasis, that would put on a uniform in defense of America, which Oswald went on to say was a country that he hated. The message is very clear. It's that Lee was willing to kill his own brother in service of his ideology. In this way, he was very similar to the Rosenbergs. They too were possessed by their ideology and were willing to sacrifice everything to that end. Oswald proceeded to have 2 interviews with Soviet officials regarding his status. At the first interview, he told them that he wanted Soviet citizenship, and he would go on to repeat this request at his second interview. He was told not to expect anything soon and to wait for a response from the Soviet authorities. However, Oswald was not the kind of person to wait patiently for anything. Antisocial criminal personality types rarely are. So he went to the American embassy, threw down his passport, and announced that he would be renouncing his citizenship. He was told that the process could not be done at that exact moment and for him to return on Monday to complete it. Oswald left in a huff, leaving his passport behind. As Macmillan notes in her work Marina and Lee, defectors essentially came in two flavors. Either they were a high-ranking member of their nation's government or military, or they had some kind of personal problem that they were running from. More than one potential defector thought that his heartbreak could have been solved by running away and joining the Soviet circus. Oswald was clearly a case of somebody who was more motivated by personal and psychological factors rather than ideological ones. When he spoke to Richard Snyder at the American Embassy, he was asked why he had come to the Soviet Union. He responded that it was because he was a Marxist, to which Snyder replied that Oswald was going to be very lonely then. Oswald apparently did not get that joke. When asked about the concept of dialectical materialism, a basic concept in Marxist theory, Oswald seemed totally unfamiliar with it. This is an example of how Oswald looked for happiness and fulfillment from external sources, because for him to acknowledge that the real source of his unhappiness was internal would have been tantamount to self-criticism, which is something that he would never do and antisocial criminal types are famous for not doing. When he learned that the Soviets would not grant him citizenship or extend his visa, he attempted suicide. Although again, just as with the incident in with the unauthorized firearm in the Marine Corps, doubts remain about the legitimacy of this attempt. However, I would say that this attempt, real or fake, is in keeping with Oswald's character. When his unit was about to be shipped out and he didn't want to go, he harmed himself, maybe on purpose or maybe by accident, to prevent that. When the Soviets wanted to ship him out, he self-harmed again in order to prevent that. As Samenow notes in his study, to say that something is out of character for a person to do is simply to demonstrate that you are not as familiar with that person's character as you think you are. If a person does something, then it is inherently in character for the person to do that thing. For Lee to employ violence against others or even himself in service of his personal goals was not at all out of character for him. Lee's life in the Soviet Union followed the same pattern as his life in America, except this time he was living a better standard of life as provided by the Soviet government. He met and married a Soviet woman and had a child with her, but quickly grew tired of the drab life of a Soviet worker. Even though he was living a better life than most Soviet citizens, he was still unhappy because his interest in Soviet life was superficial. He showed no interest in studying Marxist theory or in attending political education meetings or participating in collective activities or events. He also complained that despite making a better than average income, he had nothing to spend it on. There were no bowling alleys or nightclubs and nothing to really buy. As another YouTuber aptly put it, the Soviet Unioned him. Also interesting to note is the nature of Oswald's personal relationships while in the Soviet Union. Although Marina would later tell the Warren Commission that Lee had good personal relations in Minsk, Catherine Ford, one of the members of the Russian community in Dallas, would comment that Marina had told her that everyone in Minsk hated him. Oswald told Janine de Mohrenschildt that he didn't find what he was looking for. George de Mohrenschildt said that he thought Oswald must have become disgusted with life in the Soviet Union as the novelty of the presence of an American wore off and he began to be less the center of attention. Recall Samenow, criminals need attention. It is important to remember that when Oswald went to the Soviet Union, he was only 19. Still just a teenager with no private sector work experience, he expected to be praised and elevated simply on the basis of him being an American and a Marine who had defected, and of course his own inflated view of himself. This is in keeping with his antisocial criminal personality type. As Samenow notes, criminal minds expect to be put in charge of everything without having to put in the actual work. A football team in prison is one in which every player is the quarterback. Davidson echoes this view when she recounts that in his younger years, Oswald was actually briefly on a football team, but quickly dropped out of it when he kept trying to call plays from the huddle despite not being the quarterback. This is a repeating pattern that we would see throughout Oswald's life. When he joined the Marines, he was frustrated that he was a low rank despite knowing more than the officers about foreign relations. When he went to the Soviet Union, he was frustrated that he was not made into someone important despite being a teenager with a grade 9 education who was not really well versed in Marxist theory. He expected the world to fall at his feet, without him having to work for and earn the praise and respect he thought was his birthright. He was entitled and thought that the world owed him something, just like his mother thought of herself. Again, stereotypical antisocial behavior. A need to be in charge and the center of attention and a sense of dissatisfaction when that is not the case. As mentioned before, Oswald would eventually meet and marry a Russian woman, Marina Persakova. However, it was about 6 weeks before meeting her and less than 18 months after first arriving in the Soviet Union that Oswald began the process of returning to the United States. As Chapter 7 of the Warren Report notes, quote, in view of the intensity of his earlier commitment to the Soviet Union, a great change must have occurred in Oswald's thinking to induce him to return to the United States. The psychological effects of that change must have been highly unsettling. It should be remembered that he was not yet 20 years old when he went to the Soviet Union with such high hopes, and not quite 23 when he returned bitterly disappointed. His attempts to renounce his citizenship had been an expression of hostility against the United States and a profound rejection of his early life. His return to the United States publicly testified to the utter failure of what had been the most important act of his life. End quote. Interesting to note is the letter the American Embassy received on February 13th, 1961 from Oswald. In it, he stated that he wanted to return to the United States if he could come to an agreement about the dropping of any legal proceedings against him. There were none, but this letter represents a total reversal of Oswald's previously stated position, both in his words and actions at his first appearance at the embassy and in the previously mentioned letter to his brother Robert. In particular, I would draw your attention to the conclusion of Lee's letter, wherein he says, I hope that in recalling the responsibility I have to America, that you remember yours in doing everything you can to help me, since I am an American citizen. I simply compare this to his previous comments to his brother Robert, wherein he explicitly told him that he felt no connection to America, that he would never return to America, which was a country that he hated, and that he would kill any American who put on a uniform in defense of America. This is one of the places where Davidson and Saminow's analysis overlap. Davidson quotes Saminow in her analysis of these actions because when the antisocial criminal personality and habitual rule breaker and transgressor breaks the rules, it is because in their mind they are justified, as they always are, at least in their own minds. The justification finds basis in what Saminow refers to as errors in thinking. In this case, the error in thinking is the mistaken belief that the rule breaker is justified in breaking the rules because their rights are somehow being interfered with or obstructed in some way. Simply put, when the antisocial criminal breaks the law, they are justified. When the antisocial criminal thinks the law is on their side, they suddenly become a strict constitutionalist, and the rules must be followed to the letter of the law. In the case of Lee Harvey Oswald and his conduct at the American Embassy, we can clearly see this. Oswald arrives at the embassy, throws down his passport, and not only announces his intent to defect to the Soviet Union, but his intentions to make known to the Soviets any information he had from his time in the Marine Corps. Now that he has found life in the Soviet Union to be unappealing, he has totally flipped the script and is saying that he never renounced his citizenship and that the American government has responsibilities to him as an American citizen. It is true that he did not renounce his citizenship, but that was only a technicality. His desire to do so was clear from his own words and actions. The Oswalds, now with an infant daughter, were able to return to the United States. While in transit making the transatlantic crossing, Lee took the opportunity to compose a list of questions that he imagined he might be asked by reporters upon returning to America. Here we again see him indulging in a rich fantasy life, which recall is a stereotypical trait of antisocial criminals. What is of particular interest in these writings are that Oswald compiled a list of questions that he expected to be asked, but then produced two separate answers for each question. The real answer and the fake answers that he believed would be the least harmful to him as he returned to life in America. For example, the question of "Are you a communist?" The two answers were One, yes, basically, although I hate the USSR and socialist system, I still think Marxism can work under different circumstances. And two, no, of course not. I have never even known a communist outside the ones in the USSR, but you can't help that. Here again, we see Oswald's antisocial criminal nature on display. To once again make references to Samanow's study, antisocial criminal personalities lie as naturally as one might breathe. Their lies often serve no reasonable or logical purpose. They lie solely for the need to feel superior to others and in control of any given situation. To paraphrase Saminow, if a criminal ate bacon and eggs for breakfast, he will tell you that he ate cereal, just so he can possess hidden knowledge that others lack and gain a sense of power and control from that. Oswald lied all the time. He lied about needing to leave the Marine Corps to care for his mother. He lied about his age and being an orphan to Marina. He later lied to her about quitting a job that he said he was fired from. He lied about the membership of his Fair Play for Cuba Committee branch, and almost everything he told the police after the assassination was a lie. Remember this. This will be significant later. An interesting note before we leave this episode, is that Oswald ended his letter with what he imagined the reporters would say to him. It was, quote, "Thank you, Mr. Oswald. You are a real American patriot!" Exclamation point. End quote. Yeah. LOL. Although he had written his brother Robert requesting that he keep his return to America quiet, when he eventually arrived in Fort Worth, he asked him why there were no reporters, and Robert would say that he managed to keep it quiet as requested, but would later comment that he could see that Lee was disappointed. For a brief moment, the Oswalds were happy. They became integrated with the local Eastern European community as it existed in Dallas in 1962. These people took to Marina quickly and were eager to show her all the wonders of America. However, Oswald, possessing a stereotypical and archetypal antisocial personality, disliked them intensely. In my opinion, there were a couple reasons for this. They were showering Marina with gifts that Oswald could not provide since he could not hold down a job for any significant period of time. They tried to help him with new clothes to help him get a job because he was resentful of anyone trying to help them. He rejected them, both the clothes and the people trying to give them to him. But I think the primary reason why Oswald disliked them so much was because, by virtue of their very existence, they were proving his ideology wrong. Here were people who had left Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union and had made successful lives for themselves and their families, not only in America, a nation which Oswald claimed to have hated, but in Texas, of all places. For some reason, capitalism didn't hold these people back. Capitalism in America was not oppressing these people the way Oswald thought it oppressed him and his mother. These people were doing just fine. Oswald was not, because simply put, these people were winners and Oswald was a loser. Marina would later comment that Lee thought these people were traitors and dumb. You have to talk about a total lack of self awareness. He was a traitor and had not only left America to go to the Soviet Union, but had left the Soviet Union to return to America because he thought it would be more beneficial to him. So, really, who was the real traitor here? This was also the point in their relationship where Lee began to be physically violent with Marina. Another point in the loser column, but totally in keeping with his character. Marina was not the first woman he had gotten violent with. Eventually, this led to an incident where Marina left Lee. She fled to one of the Russians' homes and they took her in. They told her that they would help her, but if she went back to him, they would never help her again. Eventually, she went back to him, and this was the end of the Oswald's relationship with this community of people. With the exception of George de Mohrenschildt, who honestly I think was just friends with the Oswalds because both he and Lee were weirdos. That, and according to Marina, he had made a pass at her one time. So yeah, there's that too. Oswald continued to have problems getting and maintaining employment. As Chapter 7 of the Warren Report notes, Oswald's defection, his interest in the Soviet Union, and his activities on behalf of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee not only caused him difficulties in his employment relations, but they also provided him with excuses for employment failures, which were largely of his own making. There were many of these incidents from the time Oswald returned to the United States right up until his final days. Whether it was reading Russian language newspapers or letting people know that he spoke Russian or had lived in Russia, when he worked at Jaggers Charles Stouffville rather, he got into heated disagreements with his coworkers on more than one occasion, and one time asked a coworker if he liked it there. The coworker, thinking he was asking about the work at JCS, replied that he did like it there. He'd been working there for 3 years at that point, to which Oswald responded, quote, "Ah, hell, I don't mean this place, I mean this damn country," end quote. To which the coworker responded, "Well, of course I like this country. It's my country, isn't it?" Oswald walked away without saying anything. Oswald's employment would continue being erratic up to and including when he relocated to New Orleans in April of 1963. An interesting event occurred when Oswald was in New Orleans that shed some light on the nature of his character. While visiting his aunt Lillian Murray, she told him that since he didn't have much education and was not really qualified to do much, he should consider returning to school to finish his diploma and maybe earn some qualifications to help him get a job. To which he replied that he didn't need to go back to school because he already knew everything. A loser with a loser's mentality. No wonder this guy never made any real progress in his life. Also worth noting are Oswald's political activities during this period of time, both on behalf of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and the Communist Party USA. What is worth noting about these activities are that they were single person efforts on behalf of Oswald himself. When he contacted the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, they suggested keeping his activities small scale and not drawing too much attention to himself. Oswald, of course, being Oswald, completely ignored this advice, and when the Fair Play for Cuba Committee found out about that, they quickly ceased all contact with him. V.T. Lee of the Communist Party USA once sent him a letter praising him for his quote unquote work in furthering the leftist cause, and any time Marina would tell him that he needed to focus on providing for his family, he would pull out the letter from V.T. Lee and tearfully recite it word for word. He would tearfully recite it because that letter affected him emotionally, because he was receiving praise and attention. These things were more important to him than his real life family right in front of him. Recall, a rich fantasy life being a core feature of the antisocial criminal personality. Here we see a manifestation of that. The other major incident that needs to be discussed is Oswald's trip to Mexico City in an attempt to gain entry into Cuba. Here we see Oswald essentially repeating his actions in the Soviet Union, focusing on gaining entry to Cuba and then later focusing on finding a reason to get the Cubans to let him stay. But in keeping with his character, when he was denied entry into Cuba, he threw a temper tantrum and repeated the same performance at the Soviet embassy. Failing to gain entry, he returned to America just as he had returned to America after failing in the Soviet Union. Here I must stop and make another reference to my former friend T. T did something similar to this. When he could not maintain employment, he got on a bus and went halfway across the country to accomplish nothing and sleep in a homeless shelter before returning home again. The really funny part of that story is that he lived in an apartment building that was directly across the street from a supermarket that many people I knew over the years had worked at. Instead, he would rather go on a little adventure and accomplish nothing, just like Oswald. I can't recall if my former friend T had kids at this point. He would eventually have two, just like Oswald, and just like Oswald, he would do a subpar job of providing for them. But according to my friends who knew the mother of his children, he did not have kids prior to this point in time, so I guess he was slightly better than Oswald, at least in that respect. But again, just like Oswald, my former friend T's need for adventure and excitement took precedence over the real material concerns in his life. To make this point once more, a good way to understand Lee Oswald is to think about some loser you might have known in your life who behaved in a similar manner. Understand that, and you can also begin to understand Lee Oswald. The subject of the attempted assassination of Edwin Walker is important to understanding Oswald, but I will only briefly cover it here. The main point of this episode in Lee's life is to demonstrate that he was capable of murder. He was capable of planning and executing the death of another person. The other factor in the attempted murder of Edwin Walker that needs to be taken into account is that one of the main reasons this crime occurred was because Walker was in close proximity to Oswald. As Samino discusses in his study, most crimes are crimes of opportunity. Samino recounts how he was once interviewing a young offender who had broken into a school and vandalized it, causing thousands of dollars in damage. The offender had no intention of breaking into the school when he went out with his friends that night, but as they were walking by the school, one of his friends suggested it. So the crime happened. After the shooting of Walker, Lee would attempt to justify his actions by telling Marina that Walker was poised to become the next Hitler, and if someone could have stopped Hitler, they could have saved many lives. Leaving aside the argument about Hitler for a moment, it's funny to think about it that way now, because today Walker is but a minor footnote in history and is mostly remembered as being the other guy Oswald shot at. But the real reason Oswald shot Walker is because Walker was easily accessible to him. If Walker had lived in another town or another state, Oswald would have never thought to himself, uh-oh, this guy is about to become the next Hitler and someone needs to stop him, so I need to go across state lines to do it. That would have required too much effort. The potential Hitler justification was just a thin facade for his violent and antisocial personality, which always existed. It was a justification to do what he would have done anyway. Just like Walker was there for Oswald to shoot at, and just like Kennedy would eventually be there for him to shoot at as well. If Kennedy had not come to Dallas, Lee would not have shot him. If Kennedy had come to Dallas but his parade route did not take him right by the building that Oswald was working in, he wouldn't have shot him. By extension, as Thomas Mallon, the author of Mrs. Payne's Garage and the Murder of John F. Kennedy, notes in a talk he gave in a chapter's bookstore years ago, if any other public figure had been in that parade, even if it had been Nikita Khrushchev, Oswald would have shot him too. Which, at long last, brings me to the events of November 22nd, 1963. As stated previously, I'm not going to focus on the events of that day because that is not what this video is about, and it's already long enough. However, there are a few things I need to discuss on the road to understanding Lee Oswald and his psychology and motives. The first is a comment that he made as he was fleeing the scene of the Tippit shooting. One of the witnesses heard him say, "poor dumb cop," or possibly "poor damn cop," something like that. Robert Oswald would later comment that this is something Lee had said before. Years before, when Lee and Robert were driving somewhere, they got pulled over by the police. Robert ended up getting a ticket, and as the officer was returning to his car, Lee remarked, "poor dumb cop," or something like that, something to that effect. Samino discusses things like this as well in his section where he discusses errors in thinking. Samino recounts interviewing offenders who would put the blame for their actions on their victims. They would say things like, "I didn't intend to shoot the shopkeeper, I just went in there to rob him, but he made a sudden move and I had to shoot him." Or, "He left the door unlocked with the keys in the ignition. It's like he wanted me to steal his car." Tippit might have actually been a poor dumb cop, to use Lee's words, but it's only because he didn't light up Oswald right then and there like he probably should have. It's only because he had the misfortune of encountering an armed and violent criminal who had just murdered someone and did not approach him with that in mind. He was a poor dumb cop who got killed doing his job because in 1963 there was no procedure for what today would be called a felony stop. During Oswald's arrest in the theater, we get to see another example of what Samno calls an error in thinking. The arresting officer McDonald asked Oswald to stand up. Oswald responded by saying, "This is it," reaching into his pocket, pulling out his .38 revolver, pointing it at McDonald, and pulling the trigger. The only thing that saved the officer's life is that he was quick and got his hand on the gun, blocking the firing pin and preventing it from firing the cartridge. Oswald was arrested, and as he was being led out of the theater was heard to remark, "I am not resisting arrest and I protest this police brutality." Classic antisocial behavior. The victimizer pretending to be a victim. The cop killer crying about the appropriate use of force by the police. Recall Samino, errors in thinking. Recall the two young offenders who robbed the restaurant. Recall what they said. "We didn't harm anyone. There was no broken bones and no blood." In Lee Oswald's mind, once the cuffs were on him because he was no longer resisting arrest then, he had never been resisting arrest at all, as if punching a police officer in the face pulling a gun on him, pointing the gun at him, and pulling the trigger was not a resisting arrest. You are not resisting arrest, then what exactly do you consider resisting arrest to be? The final thing I would like to discuss before we get to the conclusion of this video is perhaps the most famous quote of Oswald's. As he was being moved from office to office, a reporter asked him if he shot the president, to which he responded that the police were taking him in because he had lived in the Soviet Union. Then he uttered the famous line which rang throughout history and some people still believe to this very day: "I'm just a patsy." The police who arrested him did not know his name, or that he spoke Russian, or that he had ever lived in the Soviet Union. Do you honestly believe that someone like Oswald would ever tell the truth? Do you honestly think that he would have ever said that he assaulted a police officer and pulled a gun out on him and attempted to shoot him? Later in the press conference, when asked what happened to his eye, he said, "A policeman hit me." Oh, poor baby. After you hit the policeman first and pulled a gun out and tried to shoot him with it, he hit you back? Oh no, what a victim you are. This is just another example of how the system is oppressing you. Honestly, what a whiny little bitch. Neurotic professional victim. What a miserable loser. Another reference to my former friend T. Years after I stopped talking to this guy, a friend of mine who still had him on her Facebook sent me a screenshot of something T had posted. It was a wall of text in which he basically went on a tirade, wherein he whined about how every person who he thought was his friend had turned their backs on him and walked out of his life, and how he had no one he could rely on. Basically, my friend sent this to me, essentially saying to me, "Can you believe this guy? Can you believe what he's posting?" Simply put, yes, I can. I can totally believe that. I can believe that a person could lack self-awareness to such a stunningly high degree. Did T lose all of his friends for no reason at all? Or did he say and do things that led to that? Did Oswald lose every job he ever had and never had any friends for any significant period of time because of factors beyond his control? Or were his own words and actions to blame? I can believe that an antisocial personality type like this or Oswald could totally lack self-awareness to this degree. Because in order to see things differently, they would have to accept responsibility for themselves, which people like this will never do, because that would require them to admit they had done something wrong, or had incorrect beliefs, or didn't show respect or consideration for others, or anything that would indicate a mature understanding of how their actions affect other people. It's much easier to blame everyone and everything else than it is to accept responsibility for one's own life. If Lee Oswald had been capable of thinking to himself, I went to the Far East, I got to see the Pacific, I've been to Japan, the Philippines, and Taiwan. I was able to get myself out of the Marine Corps, go to Russia, learn Russian, and marry a woman and have a child with her. And now that I'm back in America with a wife and two kids, I need to focus on them. I brought these children into this world, and I owe it to them to protect and provide for them. If Lee Oswald had thought that way, then he would not be Lee Oswald. He would have been someone else entirely. He would not have been the Lee Oswald that history came to know. Lee Oswald, his mother, and my former friend T all ended up with lives that suck because they sucked as people. They were arrogant, thought themselves better than others, above the rules they expected others to follow, and thought that the world owed them something. They were losers, and the world is a better place without them. My life is better without my former friend T, and the world is a better place without Lee Harvey Oswald. Recently, we as a society have all had the displeasure of coming to know a man, if I can strain myself to call him that, named Darrell Brooks. Darrell Brooks is a degenerate criminal and murderer who in 2021 drove his mom's SUV through a parade in Wisconsin, killing 6 people and injuring more than 60. Two of his victims were a grandmother and an 8-year-old boy. Just like Oswald, Brooks was quickly apprehended, but unlike Oswald, Brooks actually stood trial. Samenow in his study comments on the nature of antisocial criminal personalities when on trial. They behave like Daryl Brooks. They are disrespectful and disruptive of the proceedings because, of course, they are. They resent being held to account for anything ever by anyone ever. Their need for power and control trumps everything. There was a moment where Brooks angrily told the judge that no one is going to tell him what to do, and during the sentencing, he said he was not going to stand there and be disrespected. Imagine, imagine that. A murderer having been found guilty of killing half a dozen people, including our grandmother and a child, demanding to be respected. Respected for what exactly? For being a loser and a murderer? For killing half a dozen people, including a grandmother and a child? What about that is worth respecting? I have no doubt that had Lee Oswald lived to stand trial, we would have witnessed similar conduct. Maybe not to such an egregious degree, but still, it would have been similar behavior. It's almost like an American citizen defecting to the Soviet Union, saying he hates America, the people, the leaders, the system, and everything else, telling his brother he would kill anyone who put on a uniform in defense of that nation, including him, his own brother, and then changing his mind and demanding his rights as a citizen of America. It's almost like killing a police officer, running a couple blocks away, getting caught, punching the arresting officer in the face, pulling a gun out, pointing it at the officer, and pulling the trigger only to fail to fire the bullet, and then turning around and criticizing police brutality and claiming to not be resisting arrest. Whining about how a policeman hit you while omitting the rest of what you did that led to that policeman hitting you. Recall Saminow. When the habitual rule breaker breaks the rules, it is because he, in his mind, is justified. However, when the habitual rule breaker thinks that the rules are on his side, he suddenly becomes a strict constitutionalist, and the rules need to be followed to the letter of the law. Rules for thee, but not for me, because I am special. Antisocial personalities always have to have someone or something to blame because they can never accept personal responsibility for anything in their lives. Because they are all losers. Losers. Oswald did something similar when talking with his brother Robert after the assassination. Robert asked him, "What about Marina and the kids?" To which Oswald responded, "We have friends here that will take care of them," referring to the Paynes, Ruth and Michael. "Yeah, your kids are better off without you, Lee. The other guy will do a better job of providing for them because he isn't a loser like you. He can actually hold a job." Chapter 7 of the Warren Report concludes with, quote, "Many factors were undoubtedly involved in Oswald's motivation for the assassination, and the Commission does not believe that it can ascribe to him any one motive or group of motives. It is apparent, however, that Oswald was moved by an overriding hostility to his environment. He does not appear to have been able to establish meaningful relationships with other people. He was perpetually disconnected with the world around him. Long before the assassination, he expressed his hatred for American society and acted in protest against it. Oswald's search for what he conceived to be the perfect society was doomed from the start. He sought for himself a place in history and a role as the great man who would be recognized as having been in advance of his times. His commitment to Marxism and communism also appears to have been another important factor in his motivation. He also had demonstrated a capacity to act decisively and without regard to the consequences when such action would further his aims of the moment. Out of these and many other factors which may have molded the character of Lee Harvey Oswald, there emerged a man capable of assassinating President Kennedy. End quote. This is a correct assessment, and I don't disagree with it in any way, but it leaves one wanting something more, something deeper, something I have attempted to provide in this discussion. In a poem by T.S. Eliot, the poet writes, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we began and to know the place for the first time." I find the final chapter of Gene Davidson's Oswald's Game to be a better explanation because it focuses on character and development a bit more than I would say the Warren Report conclusion does. I will paraphrase it here because I've added my own input to this. Raised by a mother who was monstrously self-centered and self-involved, Lee, the child who spent more time with her than any of her other children, grew to resemble her as he aged. As a young boy, he retreated from reality into a solitary world wherein he did not have to follow rules or recognize authority or be held to account by anyone for anything. Marguerite could have never imagined the antisocial criminal she was creating by doing this. At every point in his life wherein he might have faced consequences for his actions, his mother stepped in to shield him from that and prevent it. When he was a truant, his mom said, well, he's so smart, he doesn't need to go to school. It's boring for him, and he's better off learning on his own. When he pulled a knife on his sister-in-law, she said it was a small knife, a child's knife, really, and that it wasn't a big deal. When the authorities tried to force him to go to school, she ran away to where they couldn't get to him. When he wanted out of the Marine Corps, she faked an injury and claimed she needed him to care for her. When he went to Russia and tried to renounce his citizenship and made anti-American statements, she said it was his right to do so. When he changed his mind and wanted to come back, she assisted in that by contacting government officials, ironically including JFK himself, to advocate for his return. When he beat his wife, she said sometimes a woman needs to have a black eye. He was mommy's special little boy, and she raised him to think of himself as being special and exempt from any kind of rules and consequences. This was a profound disservice that prevented Oswald from maturing and coming to understand that which all mature and responsible adults eventually come to understand, that actions have consequences and one must be held to account for their own words and actions in life. When the moment came where he was held to account, he did what he always did: retreat into his solitary world and lie about everything as a defense. A question I, as a lone nutter, have often been asked by conspiracy theorists is, why did he deny it? What kind of presidential assassin does not take credit for assassinating the president? The kind who is more of an archetypal and stereotypical antisocial criminal than presidential assassin is how I would answer that. The kind of person who thinks someone is about to become the next Hitler and needs to be stopped, but only if they're a short city bus ride away and killing them is convenient. In the HBO series Oz, which ironically takes place in the fictionally named Oswald State Correctional Facility, there is a character named Augustus Hill, who serves as the narrator of the show. In one of his narrations, he says to the audience, "People don't change. They just become a more refined version of the person they always were." That always stuck with me because it's true. At least it's been true in my experience. When I first went to Dallas in 2018, I visited Oswald's grave and I said to him,
Alright, I'm here. Are you happy? Did you get what you wanted?
Lee Oswald, after his arrest, was finally getting what he had always wanted: attention and recognition. Now he didn't have to ask, what, no reporters? Oh, there were plenty of reporters, all right. The whole world is reporting on him now. The whole world is running around trying to find out everything they can about him now. The whole world wants to know about his beliefs and politics now. A rich fantasy life revolving around themes in power and omnipotence made manifest in reality through his violence. Now he feels powerful. Now he feels in control. Now, through his acts of violence, he has achieved what Davidson called an infamous immortality. The title of Davidson's book, Oswald's Game, takes its name from a quote from George de Mohrenschildt, who, in speaking of Oswald, said, "Lee treated his life like it was a game. He played with his life." We all know how that game ended. It is my most sincere hope that at the end of this video, you, the viewer, will have a better understanding of how antisocial criminals function in society, or to be more precise, how they do not. I recently told someone I was interacting with on Facebook who was defending Oswald that Oswald would have loved him. The people defending him would have fed his ego and made him feel powerful and in control. Oswald would have loved this person because it would have enabled him to feel superior because someone was dumb enough to have believed his lies. So if you are like this unfortunate soul and you believe Oswald to be innocent and the patsy he claimed to be, then forget everything I have said in this video. Instead, send me a private message, because I have a wonderful investment opportunity that is only reserved for the smartest of smart people like yourself. I have a bridge I would like to sell you.